everybody. Welcome to the Tell Me More podcast, where we talk a little bit more about what we dove into this past weekend. This week, we were in Malachi, and we are wrapping up a series called Major Lessons from Minor Prophets. And so we're going to dig a little bit deeper into this today. And I'm here with Pastor Whit.
Hey.
Hey, what's up? I called you Pastor Whit.
You can.
Okay. How are you doing?
Good.
Good.
Yeah, doing really good.
Yeah.
I'm a little tired.
I know. Well, I don't know how many people know this, but we're recording at we get in here at 8:30 on Monday.
Mm-hmm. And every Monday morning, I regret that having agreed to do this every time.
Yeah,
I'm like,
really.
Why did I choose to do this at 8:30? What are we doing here? We could push this back a little bit. I'm tired. I want you to feel bad for me.
I think that when I heard, I was there on Saturday night, and for having done all that speaking, I really felt like the components of the sermon came together really nicely. People left having a broader or deeper understanding of Malachi, because I think a lot of times, if you've grown up in church, Malachi is the prophet where they talk about tithe.
Yeah.
And that's what I know.
Right.
Yeah, that's what we know. So it's, I don't know. It's not necessarily just that, though. That's in there.
That's nested inside of some larger themes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's an example of some specific, of a broader issue that's going on that we could talk about.
Yeah, for sure. But before we dive into that, what's the historical context of Malachi?
Yeah, well, we don't fully know. There's not a ton of clues, but he's after Zechariah and Haggai. So, and this is, I think he's around 400, somewhere in the, and I was thinking about this, how the centuries work. I know that, anyways, I think 5th century BC would be 400 years. If it works the same way that it does going forward, you're kind of 1 century ahead. Not even do it. Okay,
that's great.
But at any rate, I think around 400 years before Christ.
Yeah,
and maybe and he's after Zechariah, Haggai, a generation. Let's say it that way.
Okay.
So they've rebuilt the temple. I guess if we go back, exile, return from exile, temple gets rebuilt with Zerubbabel and Joshua the high priest. Zechariah and Haggai are the prophets in that time frame. I don't know how long it took them to rebuild the temple. A few years, maybe 5 years. I feel like I read somewhere. I could be way off on that. Not terribly important, but Malachi comes kind of a generation after that. And sort of this in between period, he's canonically last, meaning in the canon of Scripture, he's last in the Old Testament, but he's also historically last as well. So it is the book written closest to the coming of Christ. So the last book of our Old Testament. Now, if you're a Jew, their Old Testament is organized different. So the Book of Chronicles is the final book of the Jewish Old Testament. Or the Jewish Bible. They don't have an Old Testament.
Yeah, that's true. There's this, and then you, between Malachi and Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, there's 400 years of silence.
Yeah.
So, which is interesting. If you look all the way through Malachi, there is a promise there at the end that we will talk about.
There's a couple of promises in two places where one in chapter 3, the beginning of chapter 3, when he says, I will send my messenger to prepare the way before me. That reminds me that is the language of John the Baptist.
Yeah.
Prepare the way of the Lord.
Yeah, he calls him Elijah.
Yeah.
And Jesus references him as Elijah.
Yeah, it was and I did a little digging into that. I don't know if that's a reference to Jesus or John.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, because Jesus also is called Elijah on the cross.
Wow.
I want to say if you're Elijah, or some say no. Sorry, Matthew 16. Some say he's Elijah.
Yeah. Well, that was that. Yes, that was a reference to. Is he a prophet?
That's right.
Is he? Who do you say
but
that I am?
That's why I'm saying it could be Jesus. And I didn't because that wasn't a key part of my sermon. I did not spend a lot of time trying to understand what that meant. But it is interesting, Malachi 3:1, I will send my prophet or my messenger before me who will prepare the way of the Lord, and then I'll come and enter the temple, or my servant will come and enter the temple, and who can endure the day of his. I mean, that did happen.
Yeah.
that did happen. So, and then I do think, not think, the end of Malachi 4, is that right? The final verses there are definitely a prediction of Christ coming. It's really cool. I mean, if you look at the end of Malachi 4, is just a very short chapter, but it is basically Jesus is coming.
Yeah. Verse 5, behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes, and he will turn the hearts of the fathers to their children and the hearts of children to their fathers.
I did a little investigation in that. We're talking about like generational. And so, it's interesting. I probably don't know enough about that to comment too much on it, but it's interesting. It seemed to me to be kind of a generational thing of kind of who had come before them. And the apathy of their present situation, and
interesting.
And I don't know. I'm already going into it, and I shouldn't. But it was a little richer than how I had maybe previously understood it. But I didn't.
Okay.
Again, it wasn't part of my text.
True.
It could have been. I just didn't. I didn't. Go there.
Yeah. I think that ties into an observation that you made at the beginning. And specifically around the context of Malachi, being that generation, like there's that generational
it's the generation after
distance.
Yeah. I would have liked to have leaned into that a little bit more, but I didn't. The sermon had already kind of developed before I got to the point where I wanted to make where I was kind of adding that context to it. But it's the idea that he's speaking to the generation who came after the generation who rebuilt the temple. So you have a generation that had, returned from exile. You have to think of the drama of all of that, coming back from exile, what that journey might mean. I think we can, in American history, probably think something like this when you think of, the Pilgrims coming across the Atlantic and what that would have been like to make that kind of journey and to establish a new, like a colony here and all of this kind of thing, like that's something, and so that had kind of happened before them. They'd returned from exile, settled in the land, rebuilt this temple, and now you've got this generation who's just sort of like, all that's happened.
Yeah.
And they're not as...
Are they taking it for granted
Exactly.
a little bit?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, I could relate to that. I'm like, this is what I grew up with. I mean, my parents, some of us maybe are in the, your parents fought for a lot. Like my dad coming out of, the rough childhood that he grew up in, coming to faith at 17 as an alcoholic, or kind of a moving towards alcoholism, at least strongly, having been raised by an alcoholic, and comes out of all of that and the abuse and the brokenness of all that whole situation. And so, he something significant had happened in his life that the Lord had done. I just grew up knowing, just going to church, knowing the Lord, all of this kind of thing. And so it's easy to just kind of take him for granted.
Yeah. How do you think that impacted the way that you came to God and you worshiped?
Yeah, you don't, I think, that's a good question. And I find myself thinking that's why we have this podcast. It's fun to be able to flesh out some of the points that I was making with thoughts that I think would have been really helpful, which is, I think you don't feel a need for God quite so much because you're just not desperate. Things aren't bad. It is the tendency, it is the Old Testament pattern for sure. God's people get into trouble. They're desperate.
Yeah.
They cry out to him. He responds. He delivers them. Things get good. They forget God. They find themselves into trouble, and the pattern repeats itself.
Yeah.
And so I was kind of living in this good place, and things had got, were good. And so it wasn't that I didn't love the Lord. I just didn't feel a need for him because I hadn't been through. I mean, again, when I think about my dad's situation, he knew what brokenness looked like. He had lived in it. And for a lot of people, that's what brings them to faith, is they have seen how bad life can be. But when life is okay and things seem good, and it's easy to just sort of treat that and treat him with I don't know, without the reverence or respect, and I don't mean just like talking to God casually when I'm using the words reverence and respect, but just that you don't really consider him much, if at all.
Yeah.
I mean, life just seems to be going okay, and what needs do I have? What major issues do I have? It's only when like crisis hits that you realize, oh wow, I need someone. I need the Lord here. But anyway.
Your first kind of component that you talked about in Malachi was around honor.
Yeah.
And how would you define honor?
That's a great question. I wish Ethan was here. Because I didn't ever come to a good definition of it. I think it's, in some sense, it's probably, it's putting respect,
it's
reverence,
having esteem for.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And it could be a person, but it could also be a position, like a role that someone plays. Mayor, congressman or congresswoman or president. Like these are easy for us to wrap our mind around, social positions that that there is some esteem for based on the role. And so clearly, like if we want to get biblical about it, mother and father is a really good place to go. Honor your mother and father. And so there is this biblical theme of honoring authority. And that doesn't mean letting them do whatever. So I think, David and Saul are a good example of this.
They are
where
a great
Saul
example.
is king, David is anointed king, but David treats him with honor and respect, even though Saul is a bad king. And how does he do that? Well, when he has the chance to take him out, he doesn't do it.
Even though everybody would say it would be reasonable for him to do that.
That's right.
Yeah.
So he respects the position that Saul holds, even though he may not necessarily really respect Saul himself.
That reminds me, because he's answering to, like, there's Saul, but then above that, there's this honor that he has for the Lord.
Yeah, who has chosen Saul.
Yes. Yeah. And so I'm even thinking
so I didn't make him. So essentially what he's saying when he says, I dare not touch the Lord's anointed is, I didn't make him king and I'm not going to unmake him king. That's not my job. I didn't hire him. I'm not going to get to fire him.
I think that has the potential to be really convicting to people who are looking at outward circumstances and thinking, wow, this person doesn't need to be honored. Yeah. And I'm going to
do what I can to tear them down.
To dishonor them.
Yeah.
And that's really interesting and convicting, I think.
Yeah. That's part of what I was talking about. So I think we're living in a time where dishonor is okay as long as we think you're a bad person. This, like politically especially, this is true. So as long as I can assign evil to you or that you're for a bad cause, then basically the end justifies the means. So I can say whatever I want about you because you're a bad person. And again, that goes both ways. It really depends on, your point of view, how you want to talk about bad people. And so then it isn't any wonder when in the case of what happened recently where someone just like, I'm going to kill this guy. And so he decides to try to assassinate former President Trump. You just have to wonder like how, like the degrading nature in which we talk about people. So does that have anything to do with the way some more unstable people would respond?
Absolutely.
It seems like it would.
And I'm thinking about that there are these two kingdoms, and this isn't a fully formed thought, so bear with me, but this idea of dishonor being of this kind of kingdom that lends itself, the like kingdom of darkness that lends itself to chaos.
Yeah.
And so dishonor leads progressively more towards death.
Well, I think what it leads to is separation, isolation, because that, dishonor, it just divides.
Yes, it does.
It doesn't bring together or hold anything together. It just tears down. It's just destructive. And so dishonor and disagreement are not the same thing.
That's really good.
So you can disagree without dishonoring. And I think what we want to be demonstrating for our kids is, hey, here's how you disagree without dishonoring. What we do, because again, we live in how would I put it? We live in a visual, viral, in some ways rhetorical culture, meaning just the way the words we use, like how clever they are or how much of a zinger they are or whatever, like that's what travels. That's what has like political currency.
Yeah.
So we find these little phrases or sayings or slogans that then we can attach to someone we don't like. So I'll use one here. I think we're all familiar with the "Let's Go Brandon" slogan. I hope we all know what that means. And I guess what I would say is disagree with the president, but to use that as a slogan, I think moves into the realm of dishonor.
Absolutely, I agree.
Like that goes both ways.
Oh,
that kind of
100%.
Dishonor and disrespect and whatever. I mean, that gets used and we laugh. It's funny when it's not about the people we like or the political people we like, but it's insulting when it and dangerous as well when it isn't.
So I think what you're saying and what is really interesting is that people who name the name of Jesus are to be people of honor.
Yeah.
And that is something that sets us
apart. So we not only
apart.
honor God, but we honor the image of God seen in mankind. And this doesn't mean we don't want justice, or we wouldn't bring someone to justice, or we wouldn't oppose someone who's evil. We absolutely would. Basically, what culture wants to do is to dishonor people in such a way that it makes you feel foolish for ever having liked them in the first place, or even the thought of you wouldn't want to like them. That's Hitler, and it's like, okay, you see what I mean? It's like, or whatever. They're part of the bad tribe of people, and So anyway, I think the way that we talk about and talk to one another, I just don't see how we can be dishonorable in the way we talk to each other and then turn and honor God well.
Yeah. So, and what your primary kind of point was this weekend around honor was the way that we approach and engage with God, because Malachi is speaking to people who are dishonoring God by the sacrifices that they're bringing.
Yeah. Maybe a way to think of dishonor is to sort of treat that which should be treated with awe and reverence and respect as common.
Yeah.
So let's say, I think we could all own this. Like if the president of the United States, whomever that is, was to walk into a room, you'd probably adjust, and you probably would call him Mr. President, even though you wouldn't say, in this case right now, Joe Biden is the president of the United States, you wouldn't say, hey, Joe, if you'd, unless you had that sort of friendly kind of, maybe if you knew someone really closely that had become president, you might feel comfortable saying that. But the vast majority of us are going to use that title because we recognize I don't get to treat you, or I might say, hey, Casey, or I might meet someone, but here, okay, lower it down even. If I find someone as a doctor, I call them doctor until they tell me,
don't call me
that, call me Steve.
Yeah.
Hey, just call me Steve or whatever. Okay, great, I'll call you that. But if you've earned that place of I think honor in some sense, I'm gonna respect that until you give me permission to respond in a different way. So if you think about this principle, that dishonor is kind of bringing people just down, like lowering them down in lots of ways. And some of this, I mean, you could bring them like way down where you're like trying to bring people beneath you. But in essence, you're not treating them with the like respect, reverence, which I kind of think about like elevating someone. Then, and can you imagine like, what if we elevated each other when we talk to one another? What if our speech was honorable to each other? I think that's what we're called to be.
I think Paul talks about that quite a lot.
Exactly. Yeah. So what they're doing with God is just bringing him down, making him common, if you will, by offering him. In the case of the first part of Malachi, they're bringing animals, blemished animals, to offer to the Lord. So essentially, it's like we can give you whatever it's just treating someone commonly. Another way to think of it is like showing up to a black tie affair in sweatpants or whatever. Everybody would just know. Yeah. What are you doing? You're not showing any regard for. Yeah, and you're out of step. Your dress is lower than the level that the standard of what we've said. This is what this. This type of event,
communicating something about what you think.
So you're showing up to say, I don't respect this. I have no regard for what you're doing. That's dishonor.
So let's talk about this in relationship to God, because there is this truth that like there's some things to hold in tension here, I think, around honoring God as King of the universe, maker and creator of the world, and holy and righteous. And then there's also the truth that, wait, I'm a child, I'm his kid.
So I have certain access.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. So how do we hold those things in tension?
That's a great question. And I'd be curious what your opinion is on it. I mean, I think I can boldly come to the Lord because he's told me that I can. And I know that I am in Christ, and so that means I have access to God in a way that I wouldn't otherwise. But that still doesn't change I still want to approach with reverence and respect. So I think it's a posture type thing, how I think about who he is and who I am, and that I'm not. That he's not, as I said this weekend, not orbiting around my life, but that I'm orbiting around him. And so that changes the nature of my prayers, which are less about, at least initially, about God, help me with this, and more, as Jesus taught us to pray, our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. So maybe I spend a little time in that posture. Hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come. Your will be done. Focusing on God, who he is, what he wants, his worship, that kind of thing. I'm curious what you think. How would you answer that question?
I think that you and I talked about this a little bit, and then maybe I don't know if you talked about it on Sunday, but this idea that the way that we experience him has a lot to do with how we approach him.
Yeah, I did talk about it on Sunday.
So I think that you're right in this kind of Lord's Prayer. There is this idea between like humility and pride. And when we come to him in humility, understanding our position, like understanding, oh my gosh, I'm approaching the Lord and King of the universe, and he invites me to come closer. And when I come to him, the way that it, like in full recognition of who he is, in humility, it closes the gap relationally between me and him. And in a way that, like, yes, he is closer than my breath. He's like the Holy Spirit lives on the inside of me. But the way that I experience him, if I come to him in a humble posture, and that's just
it's not condemnation.
No, not
groveling. honestly, it results in a deep appreciation, a profound, kind of overwhelming sense of God's goodness and love toward you. I mean, I was feeling that on Saturday night. I don't know. There was just something about the last few days. I don't know. This has just been on my mind. God is good. And as we came to kind of singing the songs that we sang this weekend, which I just loved, I was overwhelmed. Just overwhelmed, pretty emotional, just kind of on the stage there as I kind of lurk back at the back corner of the band. And I like to be back there. I do. That's my spot. And, but yeah, to just be overwhelmed by the presence of God, the goodness of God, maybe put it that way, in my life and what God's done for me.
There's a humility that comes with that. Recognizing the goodness of God, rather than I think what the people Malachi is speaking to, they have a sense of entitlement.
Exactly.
You owe us.
Right.
We haven't. Why should we? We haven't seen you. And I think that the way that this prophet or this book is structured is really interesting. There's this kind of back and forth where he says, I've loved you. And they say, how have you loved us? And he says, I've done this. And they're like, how have you done that to us? And you can imagine this kind of argument with a petulant child almost. Like the parent saying, I love you so much, you have no idea what I've given up, what I've sacrificed for you. And they're like, you didn't give me the red plate. I wanted the red plate and you gave me the blue plate, you jerk. And it's like, what's your problem?
Exactly.
So,
Exactly. And it's kind of pathetic.
It is pathetic. It is pathetic. So I think that leads into this idea of integrity, though. And we've already kind of talked about it around honor, how when the inside and the outside don't match.
Interesting. And I think this is really good because I think dishonor sort of sets the table for this lack of integrity. I mean, if Proverbs says, so I think, the word honor is not used, but in the scripture, the word fear is a lot the idea of honor. So in Proverbs 1:7, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. So to honor the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. This is where to treat God as God, to treat him with the reverence and to be overwhelmed by who he is, and to approach him as such is the beginning of wisdom. And so when I'm not doing that, what then does that make me? It makes me an unwise person. And ultimately what I think happens is I become disintegrated, if you will.
So as you were talking about the fear of the Lord, I was thinking about this idea of one thing that really does require, like kind of a practical thing that requires fear or reverence is fire. And so the way that we use it, the way that we act around it really matters. We don't want to treat it flippantly. We don't want to be careless with fire. We don't want to leave our candles lit in our house and just walk away. But if we are stewarding it, or if we're treating it with the appropriate honor and respect, it's very powerful. It also has the capacity to keep us safe, to keep us warm, to bring very good things into our lives. And so I'm just thinking about the fear of the Lord.
And I think there's a lot of things like that where it's like beauty and respect go together, like a mountain, like the ocean. You have to treat these things with respect, otherwise they'll eat you, if you will. They're not out to get you, but if you're a fool, if you're not ready or prepared, like that's the idea of dealing with something awesome. Awesome and powerful and kind of terrible in some way. And I don't mean, the way I mean that word, but I think God is similar. Like when people see God, they just crumble to the ground. That's how awesome he is.
And if that's not happening, then we should have questions. We should have questions.
You haven't probably met the Lord yet.
Yeah, that's true. So we're thinking about integrity and the way that this is showing up in their everyday lives. And there's a few different things you talked about, or Malachi talks about, where this disintegration shows up around very practical things like marriage and family injustice, and then finally the way that it shows up around our money. So let's talk about that a little bit.
So this is interesting. I was just thinking about this as we were talking about it. So when you're treating something as common, it's because you don't know what it can do, what it is, what's possible. You're a fool. And so when you're treating God with this kind of irreverence, you clearly don't know who he is. And then as a result of that, you don't know who you are. You don't know who you are. So like
100%,
when
yes.
Isaiah sees the Lord, he immediately recognizes his inadequacy. So the best way I could talk about this, I did it at a youth conference a couple of years ago. I had all these teenagers in there, and I was like, okay, who is like the hottest guy, girls? Like, who would be like the guy for you? Like, someone just yell out like your favorite celebrity. And so this girl down front, Justin Bieber.
I don't know why that is making me laugh.
So this girl yells out Justin Bieber. I'm like, okay, fantastic.
Amazing.
And I'm like, okay. I'm like, imagine with me for a second if I said Justin's here. And people start, they're all going crazy. I mean, this is a youth event. And like, imagine if he showed up. He comes walking in and he sits down next to you right now. How do you feel? Probably overwhelmed at first. And then I don't know how long after. It's not going to take you long before you start thinking about, did I put on deodorant today?
Yeah.
How's my breath? Yeah. What am I wearing?
Yeah.
Like, you're going to think about everything that only 2 minutes ago made no difference to you whatsoever, wasn't on your mind or radar. But now that when you're in the presence of this kind of beauty or power or someone that you're in awe of, you become immediately aware of all of your imperfections. And so what's happening here with the Lord is they've dishonored him. They've lowered him down. They're fine bringing their injured, lame, blind animals, and they're giving God their leftovers. They're treating him as common. So what he's going to do is point out to them some of the ways that they're like falling short in some significant ways, and he's going to be real direct about some stuff. And I'm wondering if it's almost like the emperor with no clothes. You don't realize you're naked. Let me point it out to you. To where hopefully you would say, oh my goodness, because until you recognize your inadequacy before God, that humility can't happen, and you don't treat God as God. So there's this kind of sense of conviction maybe that's going to happen here. And so, that's what we're talking about, is he's going to walk them through. We're not covering them all, but a few of these. So the first one is basically he's calling them out on marriage. Kind of two things. I only talked about one half of the marriage issue. The first half is they were marrying women they shouldn't have been. They were intermarrying with the nations around them. And they weren't supposed to be doing that. And that was always because it always led to the worship of other gods. So it's not it's not an interracial thing or anything like that. It was just that it always led to the worship of other gods. But the other piece that I really focused on this weekend was that they were being unfaithful to the wife of their youth. So maybe this looks like visiting prostitutes. It doesn't say. Maybe this is just sleeping around in some way. I don't know. Or maybe it's just divorcing wives that you're tired of. And that seemed to happen because just a few hundred years later, in the time of Christ, he's still getting asked the question, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? And if you don't know that, women couldn't divorce their husbands, but husbands could divorce their wives, then you had a lot of power in the hands of these men who could, if a woman disappointed them in some way, you could think about how someone might be able to manipulate that. And a woman, especially a divorced woman, is a damaged woman. What's her future? What's her social status? It's a major threat to hold over someone. I watched yesterday the movie Changeling, the Clint Eastwood movie. I don't know if you ever saw this movie.
I've heard of it.
So Angelina Jolie's in it. It's about it's a tragic story. A lady named Christine Collins whose son, Walter Collins, disappears. And when he's eventually found, but in return in Illinois, she's in California. And whenever they bring him back, she's like, that's not my son. And basically, so she's living in this very male dominant culture where all these men are like, just take him home and try him out for a little while. He might be your son. And she's just like, this is not my son. As it turned out, it's tragic. Her son was actually murdered by a serial killer in the 1920s. It's a crazy story. But yeah, like no one takes her seriously, and she has no power. They can throw her in, and they do, the insane asylum.
Wow.
The psych ward, essentially, to shut her up when she won't stop, because the LAPD had a bad reputation. But what I'm thinking of is this woman.
This is a true story?
True story.
This is
powerless.
terrible.
It's terrible, but powerless because of kind of the way the society worked in that time. Yeah. Similar. A husband could just say, I'm done with you. And so the Lord is calling these men out. And he's saying, you've been unfaithful to your wife. And he actually says, you do violence to the one you should protect. I mean, that's such a powerful
that is
statement.
such a strong word.
Yeah.
My goodness. So if we're thinking about that, do you think that these things universally show up? I think that's kind of what you got to.
What do you mean?
Or so it was true for the people that God was speaking to in that time.
Yeah.
Do you think that this idea of disintegration, how would this show up in marriage today?
Yeah. Well, I think what you could say is that you can't be faithless here and faithful here. So this is the principle of how you treat the little things is how you treat the big things. So the idea, I'll give effort when it really matters. No, you won't. It's like people. So what essentially the point that I made this weekend was how you treat your wife, your family, your community, matters of justice, your money has a lot to say about how you treat God. That there's a very strong connection between your the things we would consider natural or to use supernatural, natural categories, or everyday is another way to think of it. That there's a strong connection between how you think about how you handle and treat everyday relationships and resources that have been entrusted to you and power that you have. That those have a lot to say about how you're treating the Lord. So so we didn't get into it, but the idea of integrity is to be whole, to be complete, to be one thing. And the opposite of that would be to be broken into pieces. So integrity and disintegration, the disintegrity is not a word, but you could imagine what that's like is to be one way over here and another way over here, to say one thing here and do another thing here. So, we think about this with the idea of hypocrisy. It's the idea of being an actor, of playing a part, but not really living that out. When you see a great actor and they inhabit a role so fully, you just feel like that's them. And to see their real self later is like, whoa, can be very strange if you're not, especially if you're not familiar with who that actor is. They can so transform themselves that you believe that's who they really are. That's the idea of acting, is you just believe it.
Yeah.
And so to see their real, so what the Lord is doing is like, you're acting this, but the real part of you, I know what's going on. So here, in other words, so you're wailing before the Lord and crying out to Him, and you seem very religious, and but let's talk about your marriage, because I know what you're like over here. Ooh. Yeah.
So you talked about marriage, but then there was another component, and we've already talked about it a little bit, that I think you got into around justice, right?
Yeah. So the justice piece, there's so much more about justice in Malachi that I did not touch on. But what he says in 2:17, so right after the marriage piece, basically he says, you've wearied me with your words. And how have we wearied you? And it's like, well, you've said that basically and this is God speaking, that I am not dealing with unjust people. That God calls, what is it, evil good or evil people good?
Everyone who does evil is good in the sight of the Lord, and he delights in them.
Yeah. Well, so they're calling out the Lord.
Yeah.
So they're just aiming their criticism right at him.
Just really irritates me.
Why?
I think I use this word a couple times, and it is I don't know, maybe it's a trigger word for some people, but this idea of there's narcissism here.
Yeah.
I just see this unwillingness to what you were talking about before, look at yourself and say, wait a second,
there's no self-examination.
There's no self-examination.
Right.
And you were talking about this idea of double knowledge, like knowledge of God and knowledge of self kind of go hand in hand with one another.
They do.
And they can't be separated. If you just have knowledge of God, you become kind of like, you can become high-minded and academic. Or if you just have knowledge of self, it's, the world revolves around you. You have to have both of these things to actually be able to grow and mature. And so you can't do one or the other. And I just see this question, how have we wearied, or you have wearied the Lord with your words, but you say, how have we wearied him? Mm-hmm. And it's this unwillingness to kind of say, wait, maybe there's something to that. Mm-hmm. And I think it is this, one guy, his name is Jim Wilder. He talks about narcissism is the inability to metabolize shame. So it's the inability for someone to come to you and say, hey, this is not right, the way you're doing this. And instead of saying, I should think about that for a second. I should see if there's any kind of validity to what you're saying. You say, well, what do you mean by that? Because you didn't do this or you didn't show up for me in this. So I just see this kind of back and forth, and it's giving me the ick a little bit.
Well, I think what he's saying, what's happening here is that, and the principle is that it's pretty easy to point out the sins of other people.
Yeah.
And in this case, people for them outside their community. They're not judging their own community.
Yeah.
They have their own set of problems. Clearly, we're way deep into Malachi, and he's already pointed out several of them.
Yeah.
But they're not really worried about those. Those are things they do, no big deal. But they have the audacity to look at the sins of the nations around them.
Yeah.
And then call God out for not dealing with them. And so my point for this weekend was just, I think we should be careful as Christians I see this on social media. We get on to Facebook particularly, and then we just vent. Did you see what happened with the Olympics? Or did you see what and it's not just it's basically, every week there's something.
Yeah.
Did you hear what they said? Did you see what they did? Blah, blah, blah. And it's just this kind of moral outrage constantly at a world that's wicked. And I don't know why we're surprised. This is what people do.
Yeah.
These are not, and why I think this is falling on deaf ears, because I'll occasionally see I have friends that are totally not Christians. And to watch them respond to the way Christians respond is, they just look at us like we're a bunch of hypocrites. You're fine with, you're all up in arms over this, but you'll do nothing about this. Yeah, and so and they don't have it exactly right.
Right, but
they don't have it exactly right. But they're pointing. But to them, it seems that we're hypocrites. And again, it's not about trying to please
everyone,
people out in the world.
Yeah.
But I think the point of in the Lord's response in Malachi 3 is, I will send my messenger who'll prepare the way before me. We talked about this a minute ago. He'll come suddenly into his temple, that the day of the Lord is going to come. And it's going to come quickly. And on that day, who can stand? So it's this kind of reminder like, do you think you're going to make it through that day, right, Israel? You're so worried about the evil out there, but I'm not. You're not addressing the evil in here, and so it's kind of I think it's the piece from the Sermon on the Mount, the log in your own eye versus the speck in someone else's.
Yeah.
We're not dealing with our own, like Peter says, let judgment begin with the household of God.
Yeah. How do we move if we are experiencing, if somebody's like listening to this and thinking, oh, this, that I am convicted about my marriage or the things that I'm, posting on Facebook about another person, or maybe the way that I'm handling my money, and knowing that God has, and this is essentially what you said, God has given you everything. He has a right, like it's his. And he's like, here, take care of this, but then trust me, like give this portion back to me as far as the tithe is concerned. And you're welcome to say anything more about that you want to. But just this idea of what does this look like practically?
Well, I mean, these are specific examples, and I think they should challenge us specifically as well. But also, maybe it's just an invitation to ask the Lord, are there some areas of my life that need some examination? Is there part of me that I need to offer more fully to you? Are there areas where I've treated you without the honor and respect that you deserve? Am I giving you my leftovers in some places? Is there a way that I could, it's just a good reminder to examine yourself before the Lord and allow him to bring anything to your mind and heart that he might want to say to you.
So I have a question. You can, I don't know. Is there anywhere that you feel like the Lord has invited you to do that recently?
Oh, man. I don't know. Not so much. Yeah, I think more recently what I've been thinking about is how do I it's easy for me to try to do these things in my own strength and not to rely on the Lord as much as I should. So just for me, a lot of it looks like my prayer this weekend. I was actually on the way to church on Saturday night to get ready. I turned on a John Tyson sermon. I've never done that before, actually. I listened to John before, but I don't listen to other people on my way to church. But I don't know. I just thought, I'm going to listen to this. And he prayed a prayer at the beginning, and I really like John. And he prayed, anoint this word with power. And I thought, I need to ask for that kind of thing more. I need to ask that happen more. I did. So I found myself praying. So this weekend I found myself in preparation on Saturday, particularly Sunday as well, just spending more time in prayer for the sermon rather than going over it in my mind, the specific things I might say. Lord, would you do this? And so, I think for me, it's a bit more reliance on the Spirit, which tends to not be my go-to. So that's one area.
I think that's really interesting because as I was sitting there on Saturday night, I think the way that you ended the service was a little bit different than you typically would.
Sure.
And creating some space for
trying to just follow the leading of the Lord. And that's surprisingly hard for me to do, I feel like, when I'm on stage, because as an introvert, I feel it's hard for me to be with all these eyes on me. It's hard for me to be me or present. I feel self-conscious. That's why I stand at the back during worship, is because I don't want to be seen. I can encounter the Lord more when I feel like no one's watching me.
I feel like, like if I ever go up to speak in like a bigger kind of space like that, I remind myself, like I'm talking to the Lord, and then I'm like, Casey, this might sound so weird. You're in your body.
Yeah.
I
know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah.
I used to talk about having the out-of-body experience on stage.
Yeah.
So many times I would be speaking and my mind would be outside my body, criticizing what I'm saying as I'm saying it. You're not making any sense. You don't even know what you're talking about. Look at them. They're bored. That guy's asleep. I mean, all of these things.
Yeah.
And it was so hard to try to kind of lasso myself and pull myself back. It's amazing that you can, like, it's incredible that your body can, like, you can function in these sort of separated, disconnected kind of ways.
Yeah, it is.
But that's a really amazing, Casey, you're in your body. Yeah, it's true.
Yeah, and it helps a lot.
I don't have that anymore, but I used to have it all the time.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a little bit easier for me to get to that place, but it used to feel totally.
You just feel so self-conscious.
Yeah,
and it's easy to get lost in the self-consciousness on stage.
And I think reminding myself that I'm not doing anybody any good if I'm lost in that space.
Yeah, for sure.
And so coming back is very important. Okay, sorry, that was a little like off-roading on.
That's fun though.
Yeah.
Talk about disintegration.
For sure. So let's talk about grace.
Okay.
To kind of wrap up our time together, because that was your last point.
I ended up adjusting it just a touch to Sunday, but I read this. So the first words of the Lord to his people in Malachi 1 are, "I have loved you." Mm-hmm. And really what I focused on Sunday, it just kind of came out maybe in the first service a little bit, and I realized it, and then I kind of seized on it for the other services, or maybe the second one. At any rate, was that phrase, "I have loved you." And I was just, is that past, present, or future tense? It's past tense. I have already decided to love you. And he goes on to make that clear when he says, "Was not Jacob Esau's brother? Yet Esau I have hated, but Jacob I have loved." And so essentially, he's saying in this.
How does somebody make sense of that really weird?
Okay, I had it was tough. It was Blake really helped me kind of get what was being said there, which is he's reminding them where they come from, that they could have easily have been Esau. Mm-hmm. Esau was a kind of cursed people. Esau and Jacob are 1,000 years dead at this point.
Yeah.
So, but Esau represented a kind of cursed people, maybe like Cain, and you wouldn't have wanted to be a part of that group of people. You happen to be in Jacob. You're part of that group of people. But how did you get here? He just loved you. Mm-hmm. That's it. He loved you. And so the idea is that they were chosen not through any special, gifts or whatever that they had. Yeah. Just that he loved them.
Yeah. So tiny little side note about God. Election.
Yeah.
And this idea.
I thought about it. I tried. That's why I ended up focusing on I have loved a little bit more, because I didn't want to get into the whole election thing, especially at the end of the sermon. I
just think it's important to understand that throughout the biblical story, God chooses one person to bless the many. And so it's not an exclusive, he's exclusive and he's specific in order to be inclusive, ultimately. Okay. And so he does choose the one, but it is for the good of the many. Ultimately.
There are questions about that too. I'm not saying I disagree with you.
Yeah, that's true.
I'm not saying I disagree with you.
I'm sorry for clapping into the mic, guys.
No, I think if I'm wanting to... We probably shouldn't go here.
Yeah, we shouldn't. We don't need to. But we're in Malachi, and Jesus hasn't even entered the scene yet.
So you have to wonder about what about all those people from back then? What do they do? I mean, it's great for the future. Yeah. But I live in the now.
Yeah, I know. Well, that's where we embrace mystery.
Right.
Actually, I do. I
was fully aware of all of that this weekend, and. I'm sure there were some thinking people that heard it and their minds might go down the same.
Yeah.
But what I was really trying to get at is he has loved you.
He has loved you.
Yeah, he has loved you. So, specifically New Testament's pretty easy to get there. For God so loved the world while we were yet sinners. Yeah. Christ died for us. Yeah. So the gospel is you are loved and accepted in Christ. Now obey. Mm-hmm. And so the idea is that when you're overwhelmed by that love, when you see how loving God has been toward you, then you're compelled to obey, not out of fear, like I'm terrified. I think there's something to that in the reverent respect, but more so a love seeing that God is good. And that's where I think Jesus says, if you love me, keep my commandments.
Yeah.
When you love me, you'll keep my commandments. This is what you want to do. Mm-hmm. So, anyway, that's kind of how I tried to end it.
Okay. Yeah. And you talked about how, I don't know if you might have talked about this on Sunday, this idea that people in this context where if there's they are obeying to receive the promise rather than receiving the promise and their obedience flowing from that connects to that Jesus idea that you were talking. Or
I think, so I don't know if I said this a moment ago. If I did, sorry, I'm repeating myself. But the gospel, so religion says obey if you're good enough.
Yeah.
Then you can be accepted. If you go to church, if you pray, if you're moral, if you keep the rules, if you haven't murdered anyone, then you can maybe have a place in heaven. And so it's basically obey, and then you can be accepted. But the gospel flips that on its head. Yeah. You are accepted. Now obey. So it's calling you to obedience out of grace, not offering grace on the basis of obedience.